Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video. In this video for the 2-year anniversary of this pretty controversial game, I will be talking about Death Stranding, which is a game that I have talked about numerous times in the past, but every one of those times was in some sort of ranking video, so I've never been able to talk about my extended thoughts on this game. Now, Death Stranding is a game that I absolutely adored when I first played it. While I did remember some annoyances with certain sections in the game, I did come out of my first playthrough with a high level of respect for the game. But as time went on and on, my opinion of this game started to drop, largely due to my memories of this game starting to fade. And despite me wanting to replay this game to refresh those memories, my annoyances with the game made this feel like a game that would have been a hassle to replay. So I did end up streaming my replay of this game on Twitch to essentially incentivize me to replay it. And I will say that that playthrough was overall a net negative on my opinions of the game as a whole. I mean, while I did revisit the narrative that I do still have a massive amount of respect for, and I do still love the concept behind this game's gameplay, I do have issues with this game's bloated length and at times really annoying game design that do leave me disappointed that my opinions didn't go back up after the replay here. But that said, let's start talking about the game itself. And Death Stranding has reductively been labeled as a walking simulator by many people within the gaming community, and I do think that label is overall inaccurate. While there is obviously a lot of walking in this game, and most of the objectives within the game do involve walking from one location to another, I think the major difference here is that the gameplay isn't revolved around this concept of walking. I think it's more accurate to label this game as a delivery simulator, as the gameplay does revolve around delivering these packages from one location to another, with the game opening up to give you numerous options on how to deliver those packages. And really, that's a lot of where the fun of this game's gameplay comes from. It is conceptually really basic, but with the amount of options that the game gives you, it is fun to micromanage what you're carrying around with you and how you carry those things, as that affects your balance and the speed that you move. And I do like how this game doles out its equipment throughout the game, where even in the end portions of the game, you're still getting new equipment that will change the way that you approach each mission. And obviously, you get better equipment throughout the game. I mean, you start off with just ropes and ladders, but you eventually get vehicles and skeletons that can speed up your transportation. You get PCCs that allow you to build structures like bridges, generators, safe houses, zip lines, all of which have their uses in helping you get through tricky areas. Now, an interesting element of this game is its online functionality, which doesn't function as your typical multiplayer. And I know Kojima has said that this is a new genre of game because of this style of multiplayer, this being a strand game, meaning you can help other players or vice versa through mechanics such as the share locker, which is where you can take items that other players have placed in the respective share lockers around the world for you to use as your own, or you can place your own items in there for other people to use. Similarly, within the open world, you can come across numerous online structures, these PCC creations from other players that have made their way into your playthrough. It can help you get through some really difficult spots. And I do think this is a really interesting aspect of this game that does make this empty, barren world feel a bit more alive, and obviously allows for a different type of interaction of other players within the game. Now, beyond the navigation around the world, there is combat within the game, though it is used sparsely, especially earlier in the game. I mean, you do encounter a cult of rogue porters named mules who do chase you down when you enter their territory, and they attempt to steal your cargo. And really, they're just annoying to deal with, never really posing much of a threat, with them being easily defeated by simple melee combat, which always felt ridiculous to me, as all of those fights can just be finished by simple button mashing to take down most enemies. Later in the game, you do get ranged weapons, which don't control particularly well, so I never really choose to use them unless I really have to, which you typically do during massive boss battles in the game. But outside of that, I just try to run away from the enemies, especially the BTs in the game. Now, BTs are these invisible creatures that are one of my bigger annoyances with the game. And while you can technically stealth around them or use certain weapons against them, most of the times I unsuccessfully tried to avoid them, and through that, they do try to capture you, and when they do, they drag you to another location that leaves you in a mini boss battle situation that you can escape, and that's what I do most of the time. But I do find this entire situation just kind of annoying, as obviously when they drag you around, you're more than likely to lose your cargo, so you have to end up going back to that location anyway to re-get your cargo before escaping, and all of that is just really annoying to deal with. But from a game design standpoint, I do get it. Again, BTs are the main type of enemy within the game, and without the appearance of BTs, the exploration of the open world will probably be a bit more boring than it is. Now for how the game is structured, and that is through missions called orders, where again you start from one location and you have to find your way to another with the cargo on board. Now the game is technically an open world game, though it is one that doesn't really feel like it because it doesn't really incentivize you to explore. Now during these orders you are timed, which through that does affect your final scores on these orders, so you don't want to waste too much time during the actual orders themselves. But also there just isn't much to actually see in the open world, and I do feel like that is a bit of a wasted opportunity. While there are some great visuals at points, the open world is pretty barren. I mean, despite this open world going coast to coast across the United States, you would never know that if the game didn't tell you that that was the case. I mean, there are no monuments or landmarks to distinguish the world as that. Now, I know the concept of the story does partially explain this, but I do think it is underwhelming from a world design standpoint. And I do think it would have been cool if they did include some sort of ruins within the world to make it just feel more like America, instead of this random piece of land that really just could be anywhere in the world. Even the side quests in this game, called standard orders, never really interested me that much. While I did play some during my initial playthrough, I always found them to be pretty boring, as there were even more boring versions of the main story orders. But now for the narrative, which, as I've said, I do have a lot of respect for. I mean, I've talked about this in many previous retrospectives about these games that have narratives on this really grand scale, and I do feel like Death Stranding falls into that category. I mean, one of my biggest impressions I got from my initial playthrough of this game is how impressed I was with the world building, where I did find the lore behind this game to be really interesting. I really did enjoy learning about the Death Stranding and the BTs and the BBs and the beaches and all these things that added a lot of complexity to this game's story. Now, this story is told in a bit of a wacky style, again, something that you would expect from a Kojima production. Some ridiculousness coming from strange situations and some humorous character names, which at points does feel extremely meta and can come off as pretty jarring, but again, it's something you should expect from a Kojima game. But let's start running through the game, where we do get a prologue, where we do get introduced to Sam Porter Bridges, played by Norman Reedus, which is obviously cool to see him in this game, collaborating with Kojima after Silent Hills had been canceled. And overall, I do like his performance here. I mean, obviously, it's nothing too dynamic, as he mostly just serves the role of this gruff, mostly silent protagonist, but I do think it fits the role that the character has in this story, plus also really aligns with his backstory that we do get a lot later on. Early on here, we do also get a lot of world building, particularly when we get introduced to Fragile, who helps Sam escape from a BT, and I do really like Fragile's role within the story here as well. I do like the connection between her and Sam and her role in the Higgs storyline, though I do think that they could have done a bit more with her character. Afterwards, we do get, again, more world building through Sam getting this job to dispose of a corpse due to his special background that does lead to an attack by BTs, leading to a void out, and all of this is a really great way to be introduced to the world here and trying to figure out how this world functions. Now this does lead to episode 1, where we do get a lot of setup for the main plot, where Sam ends up delivering morphine to his adoptive mother, the president of the United States of America, Bridget, who asks Sam to fulfill her dream of reforming America before she ends up dying. And we do have this mission of going to the incinerator to burn her body along with the bridge baby that he refuses to incinerate, later taking it as his own, to which he forms a bond with that obviously grows over the course of this story. We do also get a message from Sam's estranged sister, Amelie, who had led an expedition across the United States to set up terminals to connect these settlements across the country to the chiral network to essentially reform America. But conveniently, on her last stop in Edge Knot City, she ends up getting captured by a terrorist group led by Higgs, and now we are tasked with connecting all of these terminals she left behind into a long countrywide network to finish her work. And again, conveniently, with Amelie being in the last city of the trek, the plan is to rescue her by the end of this, and that is essentially the plot of the game that lasts up until episode 9. We spend the majority of the game just crossing the United States, following the orders of Di Hardman, the second in command to Bridget, who I did like as this mysterious figure in the game, as you spend a lot of the game not really knowing his backstory. And there's a lot of setup from the other characters talking about how mysterious of a figure he is. But through the games, we slowly complete order after order after order in order to reconnect America. And while I'm kind of making light of the story here, I do actually like the concept or the narrative. And again, the idea of this countrywide pilgrimage adds to the scale of this game. Now, episodes 2 and 3 take up a bulk of the game. I mean, with the halfway point in the game, time-wise, being essentially the end of episode 3 out of 14 episodes. So obviously not all episodes are created equally here. Episode 2 takes place mostly around the area immediately outside Central Knot City, the starting point, and at the end we do get help from Fragile in order to cross a body of water that leads into the bigger map in the game, leading us to episode 3, which is again the longest episode in the game, though nothing of consequence actually happens in this chapter until the very end. I mean, along the way, we are given a pretty annoying set of orders that takes us through massive canyons and us having to retrieve cargo from BT areas. There's also a mission where you have to transport a living body through a BT area, and all of this is just not fun. There's a section where you have to do a multitude of orders without a distribution center being within sight, which makes that set of missions even more annoying to deal with, as without a distribution center, that means you can't reset your equipment along the way. So I did find that to be one of the more annoying set of missions here. At the end of the episode, Sam is tricked by Higgs into carrying a bomb, and through this we do get more of Fragile's backstory, and also having to dispense of the bomb that does lead to us getting sucked into the beach, leading to episode 4, which is our first confrontation with Clifford Unger, a war veteran searching for his lost BB. Now, Unger is played by Mads Mikkelsen, who did win the Game Award for Best Performance for this character, which is kind of deserved. I mean, his performance is strong. It's probably the strongest performance in the game. Does it feel like it's best performance worthy? Not really, but Unger is one of the more interesting characters here and is acted pretty well. But through this episode, we get our first real boss battle in the game, where we do have to use ranged weapons to take Unger down in the middle of this battlefield. But really, this chapter does end up being really short and mostly just serves as a setup for this Unger storyline that becomes prominent later on. Episode 5 is a pretty simple chapter, though a really annoying one to get through, where a lot of it revolves around traveling around this massive mountain to get to Mountain Knot City. And along the way, we get to know Mama and her backstory, which is just really weird that she wanted to share this child with her twin sister. But I'll be lying if I didn't say that I found this backstory pretty interesting. And we do end the episode with one of the more annoying missions in the game of us essentially having to redo the entire chapter while carrying Mama on our back, which is a massive annoyance, especially because Mama dies when we get there anyway. Now, she does end up merging with her twin sister Lochna, who does help us moving forward. Technically, that wouldn't have been able to happen if we didn't drag her body all the way over there, but still, it is annoying to literally just retread the same steps that we just did while having a massive body on our back. Episode 6 is another pretty annoying one, with us now having to travel across this mountain area, and a lot of it just feels like we're going back and forth for no real reason, though this chapter does focus on the character of Deadman, who is modeled after Guillermo del Toro, which is just bizarre, especially considering how he's not voice acted by him, he's just modeled after him. And we do have this really strange scene where he forces Sam in the shower so they can talk without being monitored, and all this is just really weird. But again, gameplay wise, I didn't like this chapter. Episode 7 is another Unger chapter where we do have to run through a destroyed city and this underground, which is followed up by another boss battle with Unger. And all this is actually a really great set piece. Gameplay wise, it ends up being just kind of more of the same of the last Unger chapter, but I did find this area a lot more interesting than the battlefield that was the setting of episode 4. Episode 8 is then the final normal chapter in the game that actually has your typical style of missions. Again, they are mostly within this mountainous area, though I did find this chapter less annoying than episode 6, as at least this chapter made narrative sense. It does revolve around Hartman, who is modeled after Nicholas Winding Refn for some reason. Again, similar situations to Del Toro, but at least here, there's no like massively awkward character interactions. And I did like Sam's interactions with Hartman. I did like learning about his backstory, where he's essentially searching for his family through beaches, and he does come off as a pretty fun character, though one that is a bit tough to take seriously considering how meta he acts within the game. But this episode does end with Sam crossing the tar belt in order to reach Edge Knot City, Amelie's location, where the majority of episode 9 takes place, where we do traverse through the city, which is just kind of annoying as the entire city is infested by BTs, and is one of the few areas that my normal strategy of just running away from doesn't always work. But Sam does complete the chiral network only for us to get a couple of boss battles immediately afterwards with Higgs. First with him being inside of this massive BT that we can take down some pretty powerful range weapons, and then another one afterwards where we travel to Amelie's beach to have this final face off with him. That kind of feels like the end of the game. I mean, the main plot up until this point has largely revolved around rescuing Amelie and taking Higgs down, and we do complete that at the end of this episode, but it's still not the end. And I will say that I don't love how dragged out this game is. Not that I dislike what comes afterwards, but more so that this game could have easily been condensed in half if they did not stretch out some of those earlier episodes. I do feel like, considering the length of the game up until this point, I would have been very satisfied if episode 9 was the end of the game, even though the content after this is all really strong as well. I think the ideal situation would have been that chapters 2, 3, 5, 6, like all those chapters probably would have been condensed. As I do think because of their bloated length, it does make this game feel a lot longer than it really needed to be. But it is here that we do get this massive plot twist that does, again, prolong the narrative, where we do find out that Amelie is the true leader of Higgs's group, being the extinction entity, this being that has the ability to cause the last stranding and eradicate all life on Earth, and that she has manipulated the events of this game to be able to enable this last stranding. Which again, this is a really cool reveal that does recontextualize the narrative up until this point, and we do also learn that Amelie is not actually even real, her actually being the soul of Bridget that was separated from her during her experiments on the beach, which again, I do love how the narrative progresses here, though after having thought that we were at the end of the game, to find out that there's still another like 5 hours left of this game is kind of annoying. Especially when you realize that like episodes 10 and 12 essentially revolve around you traveling all the way back to Central Knot City, which means you're essentially just retreading all of your steps throughout the game, which is a massive annoyance, though obviously it's a lot easier going back than it was crossing it initially. Episode 11 is the final confrontation with Unger, which kind of felt underwhelming after episode 7, which I thought was by far the best Unger section in the game, where I didn't find this combat section, like kind of in the middle of this like jungly area, to be that interesting. Episode 12 does also contain what is essentially the final boss battle in the game against this massive BT right outside of Central Knot City, but again, it's a relatively easy fight within the game, and I do feel like a fight with Higgs or Unger would have been a more satisfying final confrontation here. But at the end of episode 12, we do reconvene with all of our major allies within the game. That does lead up to episode 13, which is essentially just all story. I mean, the only bit of gameplay here is just wandering around the beach. But obviously here the narrative does come to a head with Sam convincing Amelie to not go through with the last stranding. But doing so does lead to her being separated from the real world forever, and that was kind of expected. I mean, it would have been really strange if they didn't get rid of Amelie's character in some sort of way by the end of this story, especially after the reveal of her true identity. So again, was kind of expecting this sort of thing to happen. I do respect the fact that they allowed the narrative here to conclude without really worrying about the player not being able to interact with a lot of what is going on here. But after this, we do get the chapter 14, the final chapter in the game, which essentially acts as an epilogue, where With the world saved due to Amelie leaving the world, Die Hardman becomes the president of the UCA, and we say farewell to the allies we made along the way, with Deadman informing us that BB is dying, leading us to a final order of us taking BB to the incinerator. Again, a retread of that earlier mission where we were transporting Bridget's body, but once there, Sam decides to not go through with it, instead breaking BB from her pod, and in turn, Sam finds out that the memories of Unger that he's been seeing throughout the game turn out to not be the memories of BB, but instead of his own, with him being Unger's son that Bridget accidentally killed alongside Unger when he tried to escape with him, which led to Amelie reviving him, causing the Death Stranding. Again, like all this really perfectly wrapping up Sam's story in a way that really fulfills every storyline brought up within the course of this narrative. I mean, we do end the game with Lou surviving and Sam burning his UCA cufflinks, obviously being symbolism for him now going off the grid and raising Lou on his own, which again, I'm completely satisfied with how this story ends. While I did feel like there was a lot of bloat in the middle of the game, I do love how the narrative progresses from episode 8 on, and I do feel like this is a story that doesn't really need a continuation. I feel like Sam's story is done, with this story really wrapping up most of its storylines pretty perfectly here. It does add to my adoration of this game's narrative, with it being this massive scaled self-contained story. And that's essentially the game. I mean, Death Stranding's narrative is still a massive highlight for me, even on the replay here. And while I do think you lose a lot of the mysterious tone from earlier on in the story, I do think you still get some enjoyment from recontextualizing the story and fully appreciating Sam's arc over the course of it. I will say that gameplay-wise, I did get really annoyed on my replay. I mean, while I do still have a level of respect for the concept of this game's gameplay, and did still find it pretty fun to micromanage the way you're going to approach each order, I just hate how the world is constructed, particularly in the middle of the game, where the numerous canyons and mountains just become annoying to navigate through. And with those sections being the most bloated sections of the game, it did really harm my overall opinion of the game on the replay. I do think it falls into this category of games that I respect more so than I actually like. I don't enjoy playing this game that much. I mean, like, again, there are elements of it I do like, but as a whole, I find it to be a pretty annoying gameplay experience. But through its story and a lot of the interesting concepts that the game tries to execute, it does make this game one that I have a large amount of respect for, which at the end of the day kind of just sums up my opinions on the game of Death Stranding. So those are my thoughts on Death Stranding 2 years after its initial release. Obviously stay tuned for similar style of retrospectives moving forward, but for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.